All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for joining in. I realize I have the panel that's the post-lunch, nap time crowd, so I will try and keep this. I don't think it'll be hard to keep this very interesting. So my name is Shannon Bugis. I am a senior policy analyst at the Arms Control Association. I have the honor now to moderate the third panel of today about mitigating the dangers that new weapons technologies pose to strategic stability. The inspiration for this panel is a project that we began last year with support from the European Leadership Network called Arms Control Tomorrow. Over the course of this project, we have been hosting workshops homing in on 5 particular new and emerging technologies that we see as posing the greatest threat in the near term. Those weapons technologies are new hypersonic weapons, offensive cyber operations, counter-space capabilities, and artificial intelligence, and then relatedly to AI, but we kind of split off, is drones and lethal autonomous weapons. The concept of new and emerging technologies is a massive one, and so I want to emphasize up front that some of this tech is already present. So hypersonic weapons, for instance, have already been reportedly deployed for years, and we have seen them used in warfare for the first time in the war in Ukraine. Ultimately, the goal of this project that we're doing with the European Leadership Network is to identify and understand the risks that these technologies pose to strategic stability in the military sphere. And then part 2 is to take that knowledge and start to develop policy recommendations for decision makers on how to mitigate these effects through diplomatic norms and agreements. A tall order, especially when we're talking about such a massive field, very different technologies, and as you'll see today, within AI, there's a plethora of different ways you can go. But we're gonna try and tackle pieces of this. So for today's panel, we will be diving into the realm of space and AI with our stellar panelists who have been participating in some of the project's workshops, as well as a couple of people in the audience we've dragged in to participate with us. So we have joining us today Victoria Samson, who is the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation. Victoria is going to be our expert on all things space. And then Lindsay Rand is here. Lindsay is a PhD student at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy and a graduate research assistant at the Center for International and Security Studies at Maryland. Lindsay is going to break down advanced computing technologies for us, which involves quantum computing and artificial intelligence. And last but certainly not least is Michael Klare, who is a senior visiting fellow on emerging technologies at ACA. Michael will also be in the AI realm, but focusing more on unmanned systems and lethal autonomous weapons. So a few logistical notes before we start diving in with lots of questions for our panelists. We will turn to questions from all of you at around a little after 1:30, so I think 1:30 we'll start collecting them from you. But just same process as before, you're experts at this by now. Write it on a note card, hold it up, someone will come grab it and pass it up to me. And as Kelsey said earlier, I apologize in advance if I butcher anyone's question as I try and interpret your handwriting. And we only have about 50 minutes for this panel, so I will be strict on time. As I warned our panelists beforehand, if I'm staring you down and pointing at my watch, I'm not trying to be rude, I'm just trying to provide a helpful reminder. All right, so let's get started. I have 2 rounds of questions for Victoria, Lindsay, and Michael. Broadly speaking, the first round of questions will focus on outlining the particular risks the panelists' respective technology poses, and then round 2, we're gonna get to what are the potential arms control measures to mitigate those risks. So, Victoria, let's start with space. It's a domain that is far from new, but has been receiving more attention as of late with recent anti-satellite testing, creating a lot of debris. And we've seen that last year with the Russian Asat test, creating, I think it was close to 1,500 pieces of debris, still tracking, still seeing the effects today. So a challenge in the new and emerging technology space is just terminology. And it is, all right, what term do we use to say exactly what we think the threat is? So, Victoria, what is encompassed by the term offensive counter-space capabilities? Is that the right term to use in this domain? Is there another one? What's kind of the disagreement there? But for the course of this conversation, how would you define it and how should we think about it?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Shannon, and thank you, ACA, for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here. Congratulations again on the 50th anniversary. It's awesome. So talking about counter-space capabilities, I think people tend to use them interchangeably with space weapons, with ASAT weapons, and I like counterspace, and I'm biased because I'm a co-editor of a report that talks about global counterspace capability. So that's the term of art that we have chosen. But the reason why we look at it is that really when you're talking space capabilities, there's three places where interference can happen. There are the satellites themselves. There is the broadcast that they're doing, uplink or downlink. And then you have the ground stations. And so anything that interferes with any of that leg, each of those legs could be considered a counterspace capability. So it does not have to be placed into space, which I would argue a space weapon should be. So when we're talking counterspace capabilities, my organization, the Secure World Foundation, in a report, we have 5 different categories we look at. We look at what's called direct ascent, basically shooting a missile at a satellite to kinetically interfere with it, so to speak. As was mentioned, Russia did in November. Many countries, including the United States, have done as well. Then you have what's called co-orbital, where the missile goes, or the attacking interceptor gets into orbit and gets close to the satellite and interferes with it there. Then you have directed energy, lasers, things like that. You have radio frequency interference, jamming. And then you have cyber. So you can imagine, you were talking about things that are already there. Oftentimes when we talk about counterspace capabilities, I think people's minds go to the things that go boom, because that's very sexy, explosions, that's what you think of. But radio frequency interference, jamming already happens. Cyber attacks already happen, and we saw that happen just a few months ago when Russia invaded Ukraine. They had an attack of Asat's ground terminals. So, I mean, this is definitely something that's happening now. It's not just a theoretical construct that's happening in the future. And when we started, Secure World started working on this global counterspace threat assessment in 2018, we did 6 countries. We did the US, Russia, China, India, Iran, North Korea. And then in 2018, we added 2 more countries. We added France and Japan. This year's report, 2022, we added 3 more countries: Australia, United Kingdom, South Korea. And I think probably next year we'll be adding a few more. And I bring that up only not just to flag my report, but also to indicate, there's a proliferation of interest in counterspace capabilities going on right now. And I think that speaks to how important space is for our daily lives, for national security considerations, for how our economies function. But it does indicate this is a problem that is not going away. It's getting increasingly complicated. And so that's definitely something to think about for the future for counterspace capabilities.
So part 2 of a question for you, if you don't mind. So what are then the particular risks we should think about? You've laid out the different kind of pieces that fit into the counterspace puzzle. Like, for instance, like ground stations for me is something where it's like, oh yeah, like you forget when counterspace also has those facilities on the ground, and you have to look at the whole picture. So what are the risks associated with the weaponization or militarization, another terminology dispute of space?
Yeah, pet peeve. So space was militarized from the very beginning. So if we were talking about, we need to prevent the militarization of space, that ship has sailed. And that's not a helpful way of looking at things. About weaponization, I think, or counterspace capabilities, I think that's much more important because there are ways in which we can stop or limit or mitigate that. And there's room for that, but I think there are very real consequences, as you brought up, Shannon. So, for example, if you create a large amount of debris on orbit, you use your interceptor, you hit a satellite, it blows up into a bunch of pieces. Those pieces are up there for a while. I was a political science major, so as I understand it, the grand scheme of things, the farther up you go, the longer the pieces are going to be around. And we're talking, it could be months, it could be years, it could be decades, it could be centuries. So imagine you have these pieces of debris, some of which you don't know actually exist because they're too small to be tracked, going around at thousands of kilometers per hour. I mean, that's a huge threat to everyone's ability to utilize space, right? Because your satellite can be interfered with. Debris is agnostic. It does not care if you have space capabilities. It just says, okay, if you're in my way, I'm going to hit it. There's no way to, right now, we have no way to remove debris that's up there. So what's up there we're stuck with. Hopefully that's going to happen. There are processes being worked on for active debris removal. That's a whole other discussion. But for now, we're stuck with the debris that's up there. So you don't want to create any more. So that's a concern. But as well, you think back, this is an arms control group, you're very well aware. In the arms control nuclear treaties, there's always a cutout for national technical means to not interfere with, because it was seen to be so escalatory to actually shoot down a satellite that's involved in nuclear command and control. It could lead to some sort of, inadvertent conflict, nuclear conflict, what have you. That concern is still there, particularly since the proliferation of capabilities, it's also broadened in terms of, military capabilities are often carried on non-military satellites. And so you can't say, well, we'll just agree not to hit the nuclear C2 satellites and we'll be good because, well, a lot of military communications are carried on commercial satellites. A lot of US communications are carried on non-US satellites. And so there's been a blur between all these different types of satellites and capabilities, which means, again, there could be the possibility of inadvertent escalation where conflict on Earth goes up in space, or even worse, conflict in space goes back down to Earth.
Thank you, Victoria. So we'll be moving to the world of AI, and I will say this is an emerging technology space I've only recently started to learn about. So Lindsay and Michael are definitely going to teach me a lot today. So for Lindsay, let's start with you. When I first asked you to participate in this panel, my thought process was just generally artificial intelligence as it works in the offensive or in the military operations. But then through chatting with Lindsay, as she pointed out, given this kind of the scope that I wanted to have with this panel, the better terminology would be to talk about advanced computing technologies. So, Lindsay, for those of us unfamiliar with the involved technologies, can you break down what is meant by advanced computing technologies, quantum computing, as well as artificial intelligence? Can you kind of paint the picture for us?
Yeah, so I like the term advanced computing technologies because it encompasses both hardware and software developments that we're working on right now. And the interconnectedness between the two groups of technologies. So just because everyone knows about AI, it's a little bit more popular, but there are a lot of hardware developments occurring as well, such as quantum computing innovation, graphical processing units, and supercomputers. And the interconnectedness comes into play when we're thinking about improving past a certain limit. And so to some extent, you might need some hardware improvements to get better AI. And conversely, you might need better software improvements to be able to function advanced hardware technologies as well. And there's an interesting overlap where there might be a cascade effect where if you get some breakthrough in AI, you could be able to improve your quantum computing or hardware technologies and vice versa. So it's really important to keep an eye on both the hardware and the software in the spectr. And then also as well, it's a little bit more useful when we're talking about arms control to also talk about tangible and intangible things. So it sets me up for later.
Excellent. So part two of a question for you then is similar to Victoria, then what are the risks that maybe we divided up into? What are the hardware risks? What are the software risks that we should think about in the military sphere?
Yeah, so for the sake of risks, we can think of them together, and they're often referred to as enabling technologies, which means they themselves are not the actual instruments of interference or engagement, but rather they're improving capabilities such as speed or accuracy for the instruments of engagement. And I find there to be I think everything can fall under three categories of impacts on strategic stability. So the first is offensive cyber capability improvement. So advanced computing technologies can allow more prolonged or more brute force engagement in the cyber domain. Like prolonged capabilities could be afforded by software such as AI, and hardware such as quantum computing can allow for more brute force disruption to our current cyber defense capabilities. We can go into greater detail on that in the Q&A, but don't have time now. But they also allow you to limit your resources and capital that you're investing into offensive cyber. The second area is data processing power, which is something that people refer to as the weaponization of data. And so theoretically, you could improve your ability to process data much more quickly to the extent that you could track or target or detect mobile nuclear technologies more easily, such as mobile ground-launched missiles or nuclear submarines. The caveat I will give here is that there's a lot of hype in this area, especially with respect to second strike capabilities. And there's a lot of people who want to use this to reinforce second strike capabilities. But I would just say that there is a very big distinction between what is technologically possible when you're considering this use and what is practically feasible, because you can put up a bunch of sensors and process that data, but there is a deployment feasibility aspect of that as well. That's what my PhD research is on, so definitely interested in that as well. And then the final area, which I will leave a little bit for Michael, is the increased speed that AI or advanced computing allow, and the crisis instability aspect that this might introduce by pushing for faster decision making or more automation just by introducing automation in one area. And then the final thing that kind of is overarching for all of these three areas is I think the hard part about these technologies is that right now, as we've been, I guess this might be an overarching theme for this panel, but there's not great terminology or verification of like specific capability improvements. So there is a huge component of perception and signaling in this sphere where just because someone says they are applying artificial intelligence or quantum, I mean, what does that actually mean? And so that's something we can talk about in the arms control aspect.
Thank you, Lindsay. That is a very informative and detailed kind of rundown of how we should be thinking about all of this. And definitely terminology is certainly a tough point when it comes to new and emerging tech. So Michael, to bring you into the troubles here. So the technology I asked you to focus on is similar to AI, and that was not an accident. Part of what I wanted to emphasize with having two people in the AI realm is just how absolutely massive and expansive this is, and it's changing and adding. And so that's when you talk about artificial intelligence, there's a million different directions you could go in. So for Michael, we're going in the direction of drones and lethal autonomous weapons, laws for short or killer robots. So first of all, again, terminology question, to define what constitutes a lethal autonomous weapon and how are laws different from drones and other unmanned systems. I think in a lot of reporting and some literature can kind of get conflated into one big thing. So can you break it down for us into what we should be thinking about and how they're different?
Okay, so hello everyone. I'm pleased to be here and to be a part of such a distinguished panel. And to be part of the 50th anniversary of the Arms Control Association. I was very proud of that movie we saw earlier, I must say. All the accomplishments of the organization, it made me feel good as a long-term board member. So lethal autonomous weapons systems, or laws, is not a military term. This is a term invented by policy wonks and scholars and diplomats, but you will not find a line item in the Department of Defense budget for lethal autonomous weapon systems. I've looked, they're not there. The term that the military uses is unmanned weapon systems, specifically unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, unmanned ground vehicles, UGVs, unmanned surface vessels, USVs, and unmanned undersea vessels, UUVs. And that's what they are funding, and quite aggressively in the new budget. By the way, an aside, unmanned is the term that they use. There's been some discussion of this because of its gender implications. There's some of us who think that the term excludes women from the conversation, and the term should be uninhabited or uncrewed. But nonetheless, that is the term that's used, and I'll refer to unmanned weapon systems. So what are they? Unmanned weapon systems are combat devices that are enabled by artificial intelligence to sense their own environment, to maneuver in their environment, to identify enemy targets, and to shoot at them or to crash into them without human intervention. This is different from drones. Drones are tethered to a human operator that sees through a TV link, looks at the ground and looks for targets, and then chooses to decide whether or not to strike a target. A unmanned weapons system has the ability to do so on its own without consulting with a human. And so I think this represents a new stage in the history of human technology because it empowers software with the power of life and death, something really new in human history. And this obviously raises a lot of moral, ethical, and legal questions that our community is struggling with. Many ethicists argue, and religious leaders argue, that the taking of a human life is an exceptional act that should only be done under exceptional circumstances and can only be done by humans and not by a machine, because humans can be held accountable if they do so in violation of human norms and human standards. And we indeed have an international criminal court where violators can be held responsible, but machines cannot be held responsible to such standards. And so many ethicists believe they should not exist. They should not be allowed to exist. There are also legal questions that stem from the use. Under the laws of war, the Hague and Geneva Conventions say that nations at war have an obligation to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants on the battlefield, and to do everything within their everything they can to prevent unnecessary death and suffering to civilians in the war zone. And many of us believe, many who study this believe, that machines are never going to be capable of making that distinction the way humans can tell who's a civilian and who's not. We just have that ability to do so. Now, advocates of these devices say that in time they will be trained, they will be capable of making this distinction. But if you look at the history of self-driving cars, they've been millions and millions of miles and millions of dollars spent to perfect them, and they still are not capable of making fine distinctions on highways, not, a combat zone. So there's a lot of us who fear that machines are not capable of making those distinctions.
So now that you've laid out some more of the terminology, and you all are probably catching on to my process here, but can you name some of the risks then? So you wrote an article in Arms Control today about how unmanned weapon systems will play an ever-increasing role in future military planning. I'm sure you saw that when you mentioned, as you've been going through budget documents and seeing the sneaky names that these capabilities are nested under. So what are the concerns that the Defense Department should keep in mind as it's developing these budget proposals, as it's moving forward with these capabilities, and especially as we learned at the end of May that the Pentagon is updating its 2012 guidance on autonomous systems. And they're hoping, I think it was like end of this year, this fall, to have the updated guidance out. So what would you say, going into that review, how should we think about the risks, and what should the Pentagon be keeping in mind before storming ahead with some of these capabilities?
Well, this is what Lindsay raised about strategic stability. And strategic stability assumes that if there's a pair of nuclear-armed states that are hostile and are in a crisis or in a non-nuclear conflict, that neither side will have an incentive to use nuclear weapons first because they know that the other side has an invulnerable second strike capability that could still inflict unacceptable harm, and that creates a stable situation. So the worry that some of us have is that some of these devices that the Department of Defense and Russia and China and other parties are developing, ships and planes, unmanned ships and planes, will be equipped with extremely capable sensors that will, and also with the ability to operate in packs or in swarms independently, and will be able to track enemy ballistic missile carrying submarines, SSBNs, or, for example, mobile ICBMs. And Russia and China depend for their second strike capabilities, vulnerable capabilities, on these mobile ICBMs and SSBNs. And it appears that the U.S. is developing unmanned underwater vessels and unmanned surface vessels and unmanned aerial vehicles that will be able to operate in packs equipped with advanced sensors that conceivably could be used for the purpose, of tracking these second strike capabilities. Even if it appears that that might be the case, that poses a threat to strategic stability because the other side has to be fearful of that, and it might lead the other side to adopt a launch on warning posture, meaning it would use its nuclear weapons very early in a conflict if it felt threatened. So the big worry, and we'll come back to this in your next round of questions, should we encourage the development of these kinds of unmanned systems? These are sort of not what has been the attention of killer robots, which are striking humans, but the threat that this posed to strategic stability.
Great, thank you, Michael. So that was completing round one of first of all, what are we really even talking about when it comes to some of these capabilities in the space and AI world? But then what are the risks as well? So moving then to round two, my questions will focus more on drawing out ideas on, all right, so we've identified the risks. How can we potentially move to start mitigating some of these? So Victoria, back to you. We'll go back into space for a little while. A few weeks ago, the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group on Reducing Space Threats held its first meeting in Geneva. This working group was created in December 2021 in order to work to prevent an arms race in space. A month prior to the meeting, the United States announced that it will not conduct destructive direct ascent anti-satellite, or ASAT, missile testing. So these look like two relatively positive developments in the space domain. First, I'm going to break my questions again. I'll ask you one question, then come back to a second one. But first, just want to know, how did that first meeting go? How did the Biden administration's announcement on the ASAT test ban play out in Geneva? Was there a big outcome from the meeting, or are things kind of still just moving along at a slow pace?
Great, thank you. So just contextualize really quickly why those two things were such a big deal. So when you're discussing space security in the United Nations, you discuss at the Conference on Disarmament. And as you all know, the Conference on Disarmament has not nailed the grand agenda for the better part of 2 decades. So that's been an issue for moving ahead these discussions. But the other part is that there's not agreement among the major space powers in terms of what is the biggest threat to space security and stability. Russia and China and their allies have focused on essentially space-based missile defense as being the biggest threat, and they want to have a treaty. They proposed the PPWT, which has been in a dead man's float for 15 years, going nowhere, but they keep promoting it. Whereas the U.S. and its allies have been talking about almost like it's an environmental issue. Space is congested, it's contested, and they focus on, well, we want to identify, just because of the dual-use nature of space capabilities, we don't necessarily want to try and ban them, but maybe we focus on behavior and focus on what do we see as responsible use of space. And so you can see it's been really hard to have any progress if you can't even agree on what the threat is and how you want to handle it. So this movement to create the open-ended working group was the idea that any country that was interested, that's the open-ended part, it does not last forever, it's going to be for 2 years, can come together and talk about what do they identify as the biggest threats to space security and stability, what norms of behavior do they think are important, what do they identify as responsible use of space, with the idea maybe at some point having a resolution, coming out of it, just kind of getting the national community on the same page. And so for me, that was really encouraging. I had low expectations, I got to be honest. Before, I was just thinking, okay, if it happens, game on, but it happened, and there was actually a lot of good exchange of views, mostly productive. Some countries could have been obstreperous, and they were not. So I think that was really encouraging. And then, of course, the U.S. announcement, the commitment not to conduct anti-satellite missile tests in the future came out mid-April. Canada also agreed during the OEWG that they would also commit not to conduct those tests. Brazil talked about the idea of not having any ASAT tests. I would say probably about a dozen countries spoke favorably about this. So you could say almost there's a norm emerging that perhaps is some way we're going to go about doing it. So we'll see what ends up happening. As I said, this is the first meeting. There's going to be 3 more. The second one is going to be in September. And the second one's topic is going to be threat. And so that one, it could get a little rocky. We'll see what ends up happening. But, I think it's good to have these discussions. And no matter what comes out of these discussions, I think it's helpful because you can see, norms emerging in terms of what countries identify as a responsible use of space. And so even if there isn't a resolution, I think there's two ways you can have success. Success of process, where you have an agreed upon report, but success of ideas. And I'm really holding on to that second part, and that countries can come out of these discussions and say whether or not there is a report that came out of a resolution. We saw these ideas of being responsible behavior in space, and we want to be responsible space actors, and we are going to do that unilaterally. And whatever happens internationally, that happens. So we'll see what ends up coming out of it.
Sounds good. So a quick follow-up question
Sure.
before my other one. So at the beginning, you had mentioned the Conference on Disarmament. And for people unfamiliar with space, can you just speak briefly to why kind of this open-ended working group is a moment of kind of optimism, I guess, inspiration that there's some new conversations happening given the deadlock in the CD. And then originally my second part of the question was going to be, so now where do we go from here in terms of potential pathways to continuing to mitigate threats in the space domain and pursuing space arms control? Is there, like you said, there's a norm kind of emerging? Are there other ways of arms control that may be applicable in space? And I just want to say, especially in the new and emerging technology space, the traditional way of thinking about arms control, when you think of like US, Russian, like New START, that is applicable, but also the new and emerging technology space is, I think, in a way, redefining what arms control could be. And so how should we think about space arms control? Is it different than what most people immediately think of when you say arms control and they think like nukes?
All right, so why is it such a big deal for the CD? And when you're talking space in the United Nations, you have four you can do it in. You have the fourth committee, the Committee on Peaceful Use of Outer Space, that talks about civil space capabilities. And they're in Vienna, they're doing well, generally speaking. And then you have the first committee discussions, and that's UN General Assembly, that's this Conference Disarmament, that sort of thing. And that has just been stuck, just having these circular arguments for decades about this. And in 2018, 2019, I got excited because they were going to have, the UN Disarmament Commission was going to have a discussion. That didn't go anywhere. They were going to have a GG on space TCBMs, that didn't go anywhere. So there are all these different options where they could have had something and just nothing was going on, and we weren't seeing any progress, and meanwhile space is getting increasingly complicated. And so I think this movement to shift the focus away from traditional arms control ideas of banning things you don't like to have out there, I think it's helpful because, again, for space capabilities, it's really difficult to determine what is actually, I mentioned a counter space capability. It could be something that interferes with a satellite, interferes with the uplink or downlink, interferes with the ground station. So if you're trying to ban that, like, what are you going to ban exactly? There's so many things that are applicable, and as well, so much for space capabilities, it's your intention. It's not necessarily the technology, it's your intention of what you're going to be doing with it. And so that complicates things, and that's where things like having transparency about your capabilities, about your policies, about your programs, that can demonstrate good intent. By sharing information about responsible behavior, that can demonstrate good intent as well. And so I think that all are positive ways to look at it. And then just in terms of ways to move forward, the idea behind the commitment not to test Asat missile tests, that I think is gathering some momentum because it ties into a concern about not deliberating create debris on orbit, which everyone agrees is not good because debris, as I said before, can damage anyone, whether or not you have a counter space program or not. There's the idea of no non-consensual close approaches. The idea you don't get up close to another country's satellite without their approval or their understanding, because that's a concern as well. The idea of acting with due regard for others, again, some of these ideas are in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, but does not mean that it's still helpful and applicable. So, I think there are ways forward in terms of, sharing information, having points of contact for when there's possible conjunctions or close approaches for your space capabilities. These are all good. And the last thing I'll say that's really changing is that, particularly for arms control capabilities that are strategic, oftentimes they were seen as solely the provenance of geopolitical superpowers. This is a US-Russia thing. Maybe it's a US-Russia-China thing. Okay, we're bringing India in because they had an ASAT test, but no one else. It's not really important. So a lot of countries, the G77, they just didn't see counter space capabilities as something that was relevant to them. But that attitude is changing because I think there's a growing recognition that every person on this planet is a user of space data. And so every person on this planet has an incentive to make sure that space is not interfered with, that it's not deliberately trashed. and that it's a stable, predictable, reliable domain. And I think countries around the world are starting to recognize this and starting to become more involved in these discussions. So that's where I have hope.
Great. I like an optimistic note in the arms control space. I'll take it.
Every so often.
Yeah, we get it. All right, Lindsay, over to you. Or before I get to Lindsay's question, sorry, just a reminder that we're going to start taking questions from the audience. I have one more question for Lindsay and then Michael. So if you have a question, write it on the card and we'll come around and collect it. All right, so Lindsay, now time for your question. So we have a fuller understanding after your answer in round one of what advanced computing technologies, quantum computing, and AI technologies, what they are. So let's talk about potential arms control when it comes to these, because I will definitely say when I think about, all right, how do we bring arms control into quantum computing and AI, what really does that look like? Because I think, like we talked about with Victoria, it may not be the traditional way we think about arms control. So start there, and then I have a follow-up question.
Yeah, so I guess what I think of the two major challenges for arms control on advanced computing technologies are, one, that they are dual-use technologies. So there are civilian applications in addition to military applications, and somewhat different from space because space is dual-use, but it was largely started by the military. A lot of the innovation is occurring in the private sector for advanced computing technologies, which just means you would really have to engage those stakeholders and also make sure you're navigating carefully in like we said, I don't think bans are really feasible, but like you're navigating your agreements so that you are not impeding civilian applications that could be beneficial or potential economic gains. And then in terms of ambiguity of these technologies, this is just always going to be a problem for the software technologies. Like, what do we mean when something is AI, unless we really, really hammer down some terms. And in terms of hardware-based advanced computing technologies, this is really a challenge because quantum computing is so nascent, and a lot of these hardware technologies are kind of esoteric and kind of being discussed in the technical communities. But there is some movement on getting better definitions, which leads me into what I think the main areas that we need to work on. I don't think that we can talk about arms control agreements per se when we're beginning arms control in this sphere because of the lack of clear definitions. So that seems like that would be putting a cart before the horse, and we'd be making an agreement that might not be lasting or that might not be comprehensive. So to lay the groundwork for that, I think we can pull in different stakeholders and everyone has a role to play. So first, I think technical members of the community and legal practitioners can help define what we mean by certain increments of application of these technologies, as well as metrics. And then for the security analysts and practitioners, which is a lot of us in this room, I think we can begin by looking at use cases that we don't find or that we find to be destabilizing that we might want to curb, and then we can come up with creative solutions that don't necessarily ban the technology, but that might ban either the target, such as putting things off limits, maybe space capabilities or critical infrastructure, or that we put limits on the type of data that we can collect or analyze. And then third, I think policymakers, especially for these really nascent technologies, really need to begin to build networks. There's just still a lack of clear leadership or clear overarching strategies on these technologies. And so Biden has taken some stances and has said, well, he developed the Artificial Intelligence Resource Group, which is kind of a funny name. And then he also this May issued a memo on the fact that the US should have leadership in quantum technologies. But what does leadership mean, and are we sharing that with our allies or with the private sector? Is it leadership in security-relevant technologies, or are we leading because we want civilian benefits as well? And so I think defining a clear overarching strategy will really need to be an interagency process in the government, which is something that is kind of picking up momentum right now, but is still not there. And then we also need to engage the private sector as well as international members.
Excellent. So then part two. You said how an arms control agreement may be too far down the road, so some initial steps would be definitions, bringing in those stakeholders that you mentioned. So where does momentum currently exist towards those types of initiatives? And then secondly, where should we be having these conversations? So with space, with Victoria, we've been talking about the UN, but what's the best spot to talk about these capabilities, about quantum and AI? Is it the UN, or should it start bilaterally between states who are in the game? Where should we start?
Yeah, sorry, I realized I might have drifted into your second question. But yeah, so there is movement, especially with these strategies and I guess like interagency groups that are forming. So the Quantum Economic Development Consortium is a big effort to, I guess, kind of build consensus on quantum technology. I'm not sure they've actually produced anything practical yet, but that is the goal. And then on artificial intelligence, this is something where it's been around for a while, and so it's a little bit confusing that we don't have more of a clear strategy yet, but it is an issue that's being raised. So the Government Accountability Office just released a report in March about, it identified 7 objectives that we need to improve on in defense applications of AI, and this is a major issue that's kind of reiterated through each of the points, just that we need better strategy making about what we mean when we're going to apply it. And like I said, I think like a lot of this really does have to happen with private sector engagement, because if we want these to be lasting policies and to be practicable, then we have to make sure that we are getting private sector stakeholder investment as well.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay. All right, Michael, on to you. So we're going to talk more about arms control, but for lethal autonomous weapons and unmanned weapon systems. So the UN Secretary General has joined calls in recent years for a total ban on any lethal weapons that do not require human oversight. But countries that include the United States have not necessarily been open to that idea. So for instance, last year at the UN, a US representative balked at the prospect of a legally binding agreement regulating or banning laws. Instead, the representative was promoting the idea of the development of a code of conduct. So can you talk us through what the options are for arms control, for laws and unmanned systems? Why is there that tension? Similarly, in some ways, I think to space, where there's countries coming together to discuss this, but then they have different priorities. So what are those different priorities, and what are the arms control avenues that we can potentially take to handle some of those concerns?
So, as I said earlier, there are 2 sets of concerns. There's the legal and moral concerns about taking a human life and the laws of war. And there are also the concerns about escalation and strategic stability. So I want to discuss those separately. You could ask me about that. The first set of concerns has been the subject of serious arms control discussions in Geneva under the auspices of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. That's a funny title, the CCW, Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. This is a framework treaty, which is to say it doesn't specify everything that it's trying to regulate, but it creates a framework for the parties to the treaty. The U.S. is a party, Russia, China are all parties to this treaty, can agree to add protocols to ban or regulate certain specific weapons that are considered especially injurious or put civilians at particular risk. And protocols have been added for things like blinding lasers and anti-personnel landmines. So for the past 5 years or so, there has been a process underway under the auspices of the CCW to create a protocol that would ban, or prohibit, regulate the use of lethal autonomous weapon systems. And groups of governmental experts, as in these other fields, have met and have come up with a kind of treaty language, what that would look like. However, the CCW operates by consensus, as many of these bodies do, and Russia and the United States and several other states have refused to accept a prohibition on these weapons. The U.S. says that they perform a useful military task, that the U.S. will always abide by international law, and that Russia and China can't be trusted to do so. That's what the U.S. says. And therefore, the process underway in Geneva is viewed as deeply flawed. It is proceeding. The group of governmental experts continues to meet, but many of the groups that have participated in this process, including a grassroots campaign, a civil society campaign, the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, and a group of states led by Austria and New Zealand, among others, are looking at an alternative process of going to the United Nations General Assembly, where a majority can vote. So there is a process underway that would look at actually a treaty banning these weapons altogether. So that's possibly in the future.
Thank you, Michael.
I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. So now we'll turn to questions from all of you, and Victoria.
Wait.
Yeah.
The follow-up question is, what about the other dimensions of these devices? Is there any other possible way of addressing them, particularly the strategic risk? And there's no conversations about that. This was to be a topic that was hoped would be brought up in the strategic stability dialogue that the U.S. and Russia were in the process of holding. And as we've heard from Tom Countryman, that process has now been suspended. But the hope is that if that process is reestablished, that discussion would be held on strategies for limiting the use of devices that would threaten the safety of that is conventional devices, autonomous systems that might threaten the safety of second strike retaliatory capabilities. In other words, to protect strategic stability. So that's something that we would hope, if conversations with Russia are resumed, that would come up in such discussions. And if there are ever such discussions with China, that would also be on the agenda.
Gotcha. Thanks, Michael. So we're turning to questions from all of you. Victoria, we'll start with you. I'm going to try and combine two here. So first part, novel technologies seem to emerge and develop faster than policy can keep up. Given that, would you advise emerging tech in the space domain to be included in future nuclear arms control treaties? If not, should they get their own treaties? And then I kind of want to add on to that a little bit, because I think a question that often pops up when it comes to the space domain is just, what's the role then of the Outer Space Treaty? How is that setting up potential future space-related treaties? And then the second question comes to verification. So what type of verification will we need for an agreement that is covering space capabilities? Because I think there's some tensions there's tensions in the discussion about verification over, will it be easy? What are the challenges? How is it different from verification we've seen thus far? So over to you to tackle all of that.
In like a minute, because I know there's probably other questions, we're running out of time. All right, so really quickly in terms of treaties, so the Outer Space Treaty is from 1967. It's a foundational document. It's 9 articles long, but a lot of them are still very relevant today. It's just, how do they apply to an evolving space domain? There's a couple other treaties that came out of it. The Astronaut Rescue Convention, the Liability Convention, the Registration Convention. The Moon Treaty is there as well. I don't count it. Very few countries have signed it. I don't think it counts as customary international law. But anyways, if we count the Moon Treaty, I mean, the last treaty that was really done on space stuff was 1979. The time for treaties for space is over, at least right now. And we'll see, maybe we can see something coming out of this process with OEWG. But I think it's not a helpful way of looking at things. And so I think it's important to bring space capabilities when we're discussing arms control in general, because I think oftentimes we tend to have it in its own silo, which is not helpful. But I think in terms of saying, well, we'll have our own counter space treaty. Again, it depends. I think if you're going to be looking at behavior, that might be an option. But if you're looking at banning or preventing the proliferation of technologies, it's going to be really challenging. And then in terms of verification, I mean, thank you for whoever asked that question because I was going to bring it up and I forgot. But the main idea is that space situational awareness is how you verify actions on orbit. The idea you're using telescopes, radars to keep an eye on things and track them. Now, SSA is good, but it's not 100%. Oftentimes, if things are too small, you can't track them. But it is a way in which you can try and identify, what's standard behavior, what's abnormal, identify, if someone's acting in an irresponsible manner, you can do that. And it used to be the US military was the only one sharing this type of information. And it still is, but there's a commercial SSA sector that is very good and very helpful. And I think they provide a good alternative or complementary capability. So it's not just the US military saying these things are happening. There are other actors with different stakes in the game that can be part of the conversation. So I think SSA is going to be a crucial part. But finally, the idea is that it's not just, SSA just identifies what's happening. Humans have to identify patterns. And so that's, again, where these discussions for responsible behavior are really important because that's when the international community comes up with ideas what patterns of behavior they like, which they don't like.
Thank you. So the one follow-up question. So a concept that comes up with SSA is space traffic management as well. Can you describe the differences between those? And it seems like your overall point, and let me know if I'm misquoting you here, is just SSA will be useful, but it's not all we need. So we need to potentially add on extra pieces to this for the human element of, all right, what is the good or the bad behavior in space?
Right. So, I mean, the SSA, again, it's the idea of identifying actions or activities on orbit. Space traffic management is all different, that's kind of a comprehensive, holistic picture. And so right now, there's no one really in charge of space traffic management. There's no space traffic director for the world. It isn't there. And there are different concepts between the US and its allies in terms of what kind of space traffic management they'd like to see happening. So I think that's part of a broader discussion for that. But yeah, I mean, in terms of what we need for verification, SSA is a tool in the toolkit, but it's not the only one. And again, the idea of maybe you can have, borrow from other ideas from arms control, the idea of having pre-notifications, of sharing, transparency in terms of policies, in terms of explaining what we can be doing ahead of time. I think those are all ways in which you can help verify good behavior and verify responsible use of space, in addition to the technical capabilities.
Great, thank you. So next question we have from the audience will be I'll ask for answers from both Lindsay and Michael. So very succinctly, do emerging technologies present any opportunities or challenges for advancing nuclear arms control? So this gets to a question that I want to end with later, so maybe I'll have to scrap that one. But essentially, so when we're talking about AI, or Lindsay, when we're talking about quantum, what's the intersection between quantum and nuclear arms control? Is there any intersection there that we could start to address through arms control, or do you see these as we should be starting to tackle it a little bit separately?
Yeah, I mean, so that's why I got interested in these technologies in the first place. I do think that they provide impetus for arms control on nuclear technologies because I think handling these technologies will require a lot of resources and adaptability, and I don't see us having the capability to respond flexibly to these new technologies and the strategic risks that they could entail unless we begin to reduce the resources we're expending on nuclear. And so I really do think that this is an impetus for nuclear arms control. The problem is that when we overemphasize hype and the risks of these new technologies, which we all need to be really careful about if we really want arms control movement, is that if we over-discuss the risks and if we don't parameterize it with what is technically feasible, then we might be urging people on to create more robust nuclear infrastructure. And so I think that it's really a challenge between trying to be very clear about the limitations of what these technologies will bring, but also using it as an impetus for nuclear arms control.
Gotcha. Thank you. And one more follow-up question for you, Lindsay, before we move to Michael. So, Lindsay, would you say that this panel is kind of hyping up the risks, or do we?
Okay, I did not like the name. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Are we contributing to that, or if so, what's the caution we should have when we're thinking about this?
Yeah, this is something I found from my dissertation research. I just think people are talking about emerging technologies with a lot of good intentions, but if we are hyping it up too much, then the things we produce might be being used to explain why we need more nuclear weapons. So I'm always trying to be careful about the caveats that I bring in when I discuss these new technologies, and maybe we shouldn't have said the risks of emerging technologies, but I mean, I wasn't going to be nitpicky, so it's okay.
Thank you, Lindsay. Michael, over to you.
So this is a very interesting discussion. So are we overhyping the threat? I think no, because I think it's clear that these new technologies pose a challenge to arms control. They don't fit neatly into the existing arms control regimes in many cases. You can't count artificial intelligence and categorize them, how many, throw weight and how many warheads and the like. So they are new challenges. They do pose new risks, and they pose risks to arms control. So it is forcing us and the program you're leading to think about arms control in new ways. And I think that's a very healthy development. We've had to stretch our minds and to think, are there new approaches to arms control that will be necessary to address these new challenges? And we're making some progress, but I think we have a long way to go because we're only beginning to understand the threats that they pose. So I think we have to identify the risks that they pose that are, many of them, unprecedented in human history.
So I want to take a question that was given to Victoria and apply it to the AI realm if I can. So the question about verification in space. So now verification in the AI realm, or is that way too far down the line? What would that really look like? So Lindsay, if you want to start with you, and as a reminder, Lindsay is our quantum computing and AI tech person, and then Michael is drones and laws. So we'll see how, if verification is something that can be easily applied in that domain, or do we have to kind of scrap the idea and go with something else?
Yeah, I mean, verifications gets to the heart of these definitional questions. So I think it's extremely hard on software capabilities, but that's why it can be useful to rope in some hardware capabilities and then potentially provide tangible objects for verification. But then you get into the distinction of how much of a software can you use before you need an iterative hardware improvement. So, I mean, that's a very hard question.
Michael, do you have an answer to that question?
Well, people are putting their minds to this. Now, one of the programs we didn't discuss on this panel, one of the emerging technologies is hypersonic weapons. And that's an area where the new technologies would be very useful, I believe, in advanced sensing and computing, would be very helpful in verifying a treaty or an agreement limiting hypersonic weapons if that were to come to pass. So we could talk about that at some other point when we discuss hypersonic weapons. But in the area of AI, what I've learned is that a lot of the dangers occur before things are actually put to military use, in the training of algorithms, in the developing the software, the risk of data poisoning, data bias. We've learned a lot about data bias with AI, and there could be standards adopted, international standards adopted in the use of AI and these technologies, not as an arms control, but kind of in the field of technical standards, the way professional organizations adopt them. And there would be ways to have international standards bureaus that would test and verify that the standards of accountability of algorithms is held to the pledges made.
Gotcha, thank you. So I have one more question for Victoria, and then we have time enough to do a quick rapid round for a final question I have for all of you. So Victoria, I am impressed by this person's recollection of numbers. So let's see if, I know, so we'll test you too. So currently about 3,200 active satellites and about 3,000 inactive. SpaceX plans to spend 42,000 total, more than 800 times this year. What does the privatization of space mean for the domain? Let me know if you need to look at the numbers.
No, actually, those numbers are kind of out of date. Actually, it keeps changing because SpaceX does keep launching satellites, but there's roughly 5,800 active satellites currently. But SpaceX is not the only one doing a mega constellation or has plans for mega constellation. I mean, yes, they're planning on doing 42,000 more. Right now, I think they've launched about 2,200 just in the past 3 years. So you can imagine, over the past 3 years, one actor, it's not even a country, it's a commercial actor, has about, 40% of the active satellites in space. That's a huge change. But if you look at the various proposed mega constellations, we could see, it depends, like really and truly. We could see maybe 100,000 more. You could see Rwanda they asked for 350,000 more satellites. I don't think Rwanda even has one satellite currently. So some of this is kind of speculative, it's a spectrum grab, that sort of thing. But I mean, by the sheer dint of things, a certain percentage of the satellites will be launched. And that does change things because space is going from a domain that's primarily where nation states are the primary actors, where commercial actors are. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it shakes things up. And one of the biggest challenges we run into, particularly from a security perspective, is that when you have a shared security concern, where do you go? You go to the United Nations. You discuss this in a multilateral format. SpaceX does not have a seat at the United Nations. In theory, the United States is, Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty says that countries have to provide continuing supervision for activities of their citizens. So in theory, the United States would be representing it. But still, it's difficult. And so that's a real challenge how do you bring in these commercial actors? But more importantly, if they're the ones to be the predominant actors in space, they need to be on board for what's considered responsible behavior because they're oftentimes setting the norms. They're out there doing this. They're not waiting for the UN to come to some form of agreement. They're just doing their thing and saying, well, you guys catch up when you can. So I think that's a real challenge in the future to be able to bring them in, particularly since a lot of countries see the commercial space sector. They don't want them involved in these conversations because they see it as the West trying to double dip, trying to have more votes. And some countries don't recognize private space sector, or they don't have the ability to have a private and a commercial space sector. They just have one. So that's been a real challenge as well, is how do you incorporate non-state actor perspectives in these international discussions when a lot of countries are highly suspicious of non-state actors being part of the conversation.
Gotcha. Thank you. So we have a little less than 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask a question that is expanding the discussion out a little bit more. And so, Victoria, we'll start again with you. I'm sorry, we're putting you in the hot seat every time.
Right.
So we've covered a handful of technologies today that have already changed or will change the pace and the weapons used in warfare. So I've asked each of you questions about your respective technology. I asked you questions about the particular, technology that you focused on, but I'm curious as to what those lines of intersection may be between all these different technologies we see in the massive new and emerging technology space. So for instance, the US-Russian Strategic Stability Dialogue has had a working group that's focused on space. So we see that intersection of nuclear weapons and arms control in space being brought increasingly in, as well as there's a working group on cyber. So the question for each of you, and try and keep your answers short, which will be difficult with a broader question like this, but are there options for arms control that encompass more than one technology than the one you focused on today? And if so, what technology on your dream list would you say overlaps really well and that you would want to package together into one agreement or some type of arrangement? It doesn't have to be legally binding. What's kind of your ideal picture if you're just all right, the risks between space and something else are pretty similar, so we can tackle that with one arrangement. Victoria?
I don't think you can, I'm sorry. Done. No,
All right,
moving on. No, I mean, it's challenging because, I think, in terms of for space, what the benefit from space is information, it's data. And so you can say, okay, that maybe has an interwoven connection with cyber or even, AI if you're talking, computing and that sort of thing. But it's challenging because I think oftentimes, at least in my experience, some of the more exciting topics get precedent, and so you do a cyberspace dialogue, it becomes a cyber dialogue, and then oh yeah, we probably need space included in the issue. So I'm reluctant to combine things. I think it's important to make sure that you have maybe input from various actors, but if you really want to get down in the weeds and really, focus on the issue at hand, oftentimes it can be overwhelmed by a more exciting topic. So that's why I'm a standalone type person.
Space only.
Space all the way.
Lindsay?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess this might get at the trend we identified, which are we moving away from controls or agreements on the technologies themselves? And if so, I mean, I definitely think if we are controlling the technologies themselves, these are just really different technologies, and then you're undervaluing the technical characteristics of each. But if we are moving away from that, then I suppose there might be a world in which we could identify controls on, end uses or targets that we would not allow interference on, such as critical infrastructure. Maybe that is a place to start. And then I would just respond to Michael. I definitely think we agree about the hype thing. So I'm only saying we just need to be careful when we're talking about the hype regarding the impact on nuclear survivability and nuclear infrastructure. And I guess my main point is I think we definitely undervalue the risks of arm racing instability when we are looking at the technologies. And that's why I have a bone to pick about hype, but we agree on that.
Thank you, Lindsay. Michael, to you, and you're bringing it home for us. We're at time, so I'm sorry we left you with little time to respond, but over to you.
I'm overwhelmed by this question. It's hard. It does come back to the strategic stability dialogue, because I think we have learned that the old threats that we understand and we can control, ICBMs and the like, are now being supplemented by a whole array of other kinds of systems that are exceedingly dangerous but don't fit under any of our umbrellas for control. And the only way that's going to change is when the major powers begin to discuss them and the professionals from each side meet. And so what you really need to have are technical working groups of Russians, Chinese, and Americans who have the technical expertise in these fields to sit down with one another and to work out how you can develop a regime to control them. And so we must have conversations with those countries. And it's how we get to that is hard for me to see. But that's what our conversation today has been about. How do we get to that point? But we need to work back from where I don't know if I'm doing justice to what you said, but to work back from where are the dangers to stability, identifying the dangers to stability posed by these new technologies, and how can we diminish those dangers?
Thank you. I know it was a broad question, so thanks everyone for taking a stab at it. So before we thank our marvelous panelists, just up next, we have another guest video from Friends of ACA, so stay tuned. And other than that, please help me in thanking our panelists.